Welcome everybody to our program tonight. I'm so glad you could join us for our conversation between author Gerald Horne and Justin Desmangles on Dr. Horne's new book, Armed Struggle, Panthers, Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in Southern California during the 60s and 70s. This program is sponsored in partnership with the Before Columbus Foundation and the African American Center. I'm Shauna Sherman, manager of the African American Center at the San Francisco Library. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in the area now known as San Francisco, which is on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the original peoples of this land, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, and we recognize that we benefit from living, working, and learning on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, relatives, and elders of the Ramaytush community. As the African American Center, we also give an ancestral acknowledgement, which has been adapted from the San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee. We honor the gifts, resilience, and sacrifices of our Black ancestors who toiled the land, built the institutions that established this nation's wealth and freedom, and survived anti-Black racism despite never being compensated nor fully realizing their own sovereignty. We acknowledge this exploitation of not only labor, but of our humanity, and through information sharing, we are working to repair some of the harms done by public and private actors. So we are on the eve of Black History Month, and we call that More Than a Month here at the San Francisco Public Library. We have a ton going on at the center on the third floor of the main library. And I'll quickly go through some of the programs we are offering before we start our program. And more information on these programs is available on sfpl.org. So our More Than a Month art is called From the Hill and Beyond, number 6, by Brother Malik Seneferu. Come to the African American Center on the third floor of the main library to view Malik Seneferu's original painting, sculpture, and digital art in a retrospective of the Hunters Point natives' more than 30-year career, which will be on, his art will be on view in the center through April 20th. And a huge thank you to Afro Solo Theater Company for sponsoring the event. So why not come to see the space this Sunday when we host Omo Moses in conversation with Belvy Rooks on Mr. Moses's new book, The White Peril, a family memoir about basketball, civil rights, Africa, and growing up Black in America. That's this Sunday, February 2nd at 2 p.m. Next weekend, also in person, we celebrate emerging Bay Area writers in 2 events. On Saturday, hear from fellows in the culminating event for the Muses and Melanin Fellowship, a professional development program for Black BIPOC writers. And on Sunday, we hear from participants in the Black Women's Writing Workshop sponsored by the Afro Solo Theater Company and the Dr. George W. Davis Senior Center's Intergenerational Program. And Justin Desmangles will be back in our virtual library on Wednesday, February 12th with author Ronald B. Neal to talk about Mr. Neal's new book, Beyond Death and Jail, Anti-Blackness, Black Masculinity, and the Demonic Imagination. And we're back in person on February 15th to watch the Black Kung Fu experience with a live Kung Fu demonstration with Grandmaster Troy Dunwood. And closing out our African American Center programs, we welcome Dante King back to the library, who will host a screening and dialogue around his new book, Whiteness and Anti-Blackness. So those are just a few of the events offered through the San Francisco Public Library for our More Than a Month celebration. Go to on.sfpl.org/more-than-a-month to see a full list of everything that's happening that our library has to offer, from craft programs to musical performances, book clubs, films, and more. And now on to our show. Once again, we're so grateful to Justin Desmangles, chairman of the Before Columbus Foundation, and which administers the American Book Award for bringing Dr. Horne to the library. Our guests will engage in a conversation followed by a Q&A. If you have a question, please leave it in the Q&A portion of the Zoom, which is found at the bottom of your screen with the Q&A button. First, a little information on Dr. Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is a prolific Marxist historian and author considered one of the greatest historians of our time by Dr. Cornel West. Raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Horne received his undergraduate education at Princeton, received his Ph.D. from Columbia University, and a J.D. from the University of California, Berkeley. He is currently the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne has written nearly 40 books, and we have more than 24 of those available for checkout at the library, which deal with the confluence of African American history, communist history, the struggle for liberation, internationalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, white supremacy, and fascism. Please welcome Justin Demong and Dr. Gerald Horne to your screen.
Well, Gerald, first, let me thank you for being so generous with your time and joining us this evening. As many of you know, Mr. Horne was recently, just a few years ago, the recipient of the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for his book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. And as I understand it, as we gain more ground in this evening's discussion, we will be returning to some of the more prescient themes of this book as they reemerge in the 21st century. But as Shauna mentioned just a moment ago, our purposes this evening are to discuss armed struggle, Panthers and communists, Black nationalists and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. I want to say very briefly before we get started that this is an extraordinarily rigorous, inventive, and powerfully deciphering effort on the part of one of our preeminent historians, Gerald Horne. In talking about that, it is a very urgent and necessary, and I would say even further medicinal book for a number of different reasons. Some of those reasons having to do with the fact that it deals with a period of history in the United States and internationally that is under duress. That is to say that over the last 6 decades, minimally, there has been an assiduous effort on the part of many institutions of authority, including those associated most strictly with the government of the United States, to erase, flatten out, or minimally make caricature of this particular time when, on the cusp of the Cultural Revolution, we were precipitate to a political revolution. And so as advertising culture and consumerism, which is, in point of fact, the public relations of imperialism, okay, as the slave system of the West is called. The advertising and consumerist culture, as well as the culture of the authority in the academy, has really done the lion's share of the work in attempting to erase this period. And so with that said, Gerald Horne, can you talk to us about some of the particular challenges that you faced as you were developing and constructing the complex narratives that weave this book together?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this session. For those who have perused this text, you may have noticed that some of the research was actually conducted at the San Francisco Public Library, in addition to other institutions in the vicinity, including UC Berkeley, Stanford, uh, the California State Archives in Sacramento for the earlier part of this book. And on a personal note, I should mention that I first visited the San Francisco Bay Area in the summer of 1969 to attend a conference organized by the Black Panther Party. And I was so taken by the region and the area that I returned the next year to live in the Sunset District of San Francisco, which was preliminary to my enrolling as a student at the law school at the University of California, Berkeley. And as I mentioned in these pages, I also taught as a law student at the so-called correctional institution in Vacaville, where, by the way, one of my students was a man then known as Donald DeFries. I lent him a copy of my tattered texts by Frederick Engels, The Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State. I never received the text back because a year or so later, he went up in flames as a result of a shootout with the LAPD. He was accused of being involved in the kidnapping and alleged brainwashing of newspaper heiress Patty Hearst. The lesson I draw from that is be careful who you lend your books to. I should also say that I worked with the Panthers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and to show you that that's not puffery, I cite correspondence from a Panther leader that references some of my activity. Actually, was working with the Berkeley City Council on a rent control initiative. I'm not sure if that has survived, if Berkeley still has rent control, but if so, I'd like to claim partial, mini credit. And I also happened to be in 1972 at the celebration party after Professor Angela Davis was freed on capital charges involving what is depicted on the cover of the book. That is to say, she was accused of being complicit in the effort by precocious teenager Jonathan Jackson of Pasadena to supposedly free his brother, the now celebrated late political prisoner George Jackson. And I knew Professor Davis's lawyer, Howard Moore, who plays a pivotal role in this book because his spouse, Jane Bondmore, was a law school classmate of mine. I only mentioned that just to make our discussion a bit more personal and also indicate the stakes at play.
Well, certainly one of the unique features of this particular book, Armed Struggle, is that the reader is invited into not just the agility of your own research and intellect bearing on this subject, but also the welcoming warmth of your own personal wit. In other words, because you've been able to weave so much of your own biography into the pages, we have an opportunity to explore some of the emotional texture and response that you, as a person, as a man experiencing these events firsthand, had as you reacted to them, but also as you scribed them to us in the form of this history. But let me return back a few moments to something I said at the beginning, which concerns the effort to produce caricature in the popular culture of the United States rather than explanation of what was taking place during this time. Again, I mentioned consumerism as the public relations of imperialism. I think that's fair to say. And that's where much of this caricaturing, particularly of the Black Panthers, but of many, many groups who advocated a militancy during this period of tumult, of upheaval. Some would say disorder. So, in thinking about that, were there particular challenges that you found that you were faced with in telling this story? Were there obstacles or hurdles that you felt that you really had to focus on and take down, myths perhaps that you needed to bust open?
Well, actually, it ties into your previous point because, and by the way, those who are wondering, does he or doesn't he? Only as person who takes care of my hair knows for sure. This gray hair is legitimate. It's not a dye job. So you may have been able to infer that from my talking about what happened over a half century ago. But in any case, with regard to your previous point as well, you may have seen the most recent executive order by the Tangerine Tyrant, which is supposedly going to withdraw federal funds from schools that don't toe the line with regard to teaching about slavery, for example. You may have noticed that the incoming Secretary of Defense has talked about restoring the names of Confederate generals, those who sought to overthrow the United States in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. Restore their names to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Benning in Georgia, after a protracted struggle to get those names changed. I think that part of the problem in writing a book like this is that there is deep-seated anti-communism in the United States of America, to put it mildly. There's deep-seated anti-Blackness in the United States of America, to put it mildly. And so if you're writing a book that challenges anti-communism and challenges anti-Blackness, well, obviously you're going to encounter formidable barriers, even sometimes on the part of those who really should know better, or perhaps don't even recognize that they may be reflecting anti-communism or anti-Blackness, for example. And I should also say that even though ostensibly and actually this book deals heavily with the Southland, Southern California, the region stretching from Santa Barbara south to the Mexican border, and the Pacific Ocean east to Arizona border and Nevada border, you may have gathered that there is not only a lot of area history in this book. And how could that be avoided? Because one of the themes of this book is the real and imagined tension between North and South. Because as you know, after the United States seizes California in the War of Aggression against Mexico, concluding in 1848, the population center was north in San Francisco. And of course, finance capital in terms of the Bank of America, initiated by those of Italian ancestry, was also in the north. But over time, that began to change, as we know, because now the population center is heavily in the south. But political control, even in left-wing organizations like the Communist Party and even the Black Panther Party, remained in the north. And that created logistical barriers, that created political tension. But having said that, as noted, there's quite a bit of history of the Black Panther Party in San Francisco, for example. Eldridge Cleaver, who was one of my main characters, who actually grew up in the Southland, but then was imprisoned up north. That's also one of the contradictions. The prisons are heavily up north. But after he was freed, not least because of the administrations of the San Francisco-based lawyer Beverly Axelrod, who deserves a biography herself, by the way, for various reasons. He then lived in San Francisco and remained a resident of San Francisco until he flew the coup and wound up in Algeria. But then even after he decided to return from exile, he didn't move south, he moved back to the Bay Area. And then there's quite a bit in this book on the student strike at San Francisco State University.
Yes.
Because Panthers were involved. George Murray, for example, for a while was the Minister of Education of the Panthers. The celebrated actor Danny Glover was involved as well. And I should also say that crossing the Bay, needless to say, there's quite a bit on Oakland and the activism of one Huey P. Newton, who is given credit for being the founder of the party, along with his comrade Bobby Seale, also from across the Bay. So I think that this book contributes and adds to the historiography of a number of different areas, not only the area of Black radicalism and the Communist Party, but also the history of the San Francisco Bay Area.
One of the illuminating powers that a reader discovers in this text is the extraordinary diversity among the myriad militant groups who were ostensibly, fighting against the same enemy, or so their rhetoric might suggest, but in fact had a tremendous amount of tensions and disagreement, much of which it needs to be emphasized was actually the discord that was sown by the sinister counterintelligence programs under the direction of the FBI and other intelligence work against these organizations. But what I'm focusing on here, which you offer such illumination to, is the fact that far from a united front, there were many fissures, which again were exploited by the United States government to try to break all of these groups apart. But could you talk to us a little bit more about that? You mentioned a moment or two ago about the morbid fear of communism and how that has really debilitated a lot of scholarship about this period. But could you talk to us about the variations of opinion within the various groups that, as I mentioned, ostensibly are fighting against the same enemy, but in fact, there was considerable argument and division among them, some real, some not. Again, in contradistinction to the caricatures that are often offered us today, Gerald Horne, could you talk to us about some of the argument and division among the many militant groups of the period?
Well, let me start with a previous thread and make reference to William L. Patterson, born in San Francisco, circa 1890, dying in Harlem, circa 1980, in between a law student at the University of California, also a significant influence on the late, great Paul Robeson,
yes,
who figures in this text. And also, it was William L. Patterson who led the charge to free the Scottsboro Nine, a pivotal, instrumental human rights case of the 1930s involving 9 Black youth in Scottsboro, Alabama, accused falsely and maliciously of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women. It was Patterson, who by that time had joined the Communist Party, who was able to generate a global movement against U.S. Jim Crow, not unlike the movement against apartheid that led to the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994. It was Patterson and Robeson who also filed the petition at the United Nations circa 1950, 1951, charging the United States with perpetrating genocide against Black people, not unlike the petition that the South African government has brought against Israel in the International Court of Justice with a similar claim, making out a plausible case for genocide. But that brings me to COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, initially targeting the Communist Party circa 1956. But as these programs tend to do, expanding its jurisdiction to encompass the Black freedom movement, figures like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, and of course, the Black Panther Party. With regard to the internecine conflicts that you make reference to, they're not only conflicts within the Black Panther Party itself, not to mention conflicts within the Communist Party itself that the authorities play upon, but there are also conflicts between and amongst various organizations that ostensibly you would think at least shared the same anti-Jim Crow goal. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of another San Francisco figure who merits a biography, Dr. Carlton Goodlett.
Yes.
Who not only was a publisher of the Sun Reporter, a Black newspaper in San Francisco, but also he was a leader of the NAACP chapter in San Francisco. And there hangs a tale because the NAACP plays a major role in this book because the leadership and many of the branches decided to throw in their lot with the anti-communist purges, oftentimes turning their back once again on a San Francisco-based union, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union under the late, great Harry Bridges. Mm-hmm. Wellborn in Melbourne, Australia, leads the San Francisco General Strike of 1934. The union is in the forefront and the vanguard of breaking down Jim Crow barriers, allowing Black men in particular to become longshoremen, many of whom are still on the docks, they or their descendants.
That's right.
But interestingly, the NAACP turned its back on the ILWU and actually made alliances with racist maritime unions, of which the San Francisco Bay Area had more than its share. But what's interesting about that as well is that the leader of the NAACP in the Bay Area, who had sort of oversight over Goodlett and all of the chapters, because of course there were chapters in the Bay, in Oakland and Palo Alto, et cetera, and actually he commuted between Palo Alto and San Francisco. I'm thinking of Franklin Williams, who led the anti-communist charge. And by the way, at one time he was quite close as well to Beverly Axelrod. Recall I mentioned her because of her being quite close to Eldridge Cleaver, helping to free him from prison and his meteoric rise subsequently.
Yeah.
But Franklin Williams of the San Francisco Bay Area was awarded, as the political climate began to shift, was rewarded, I should say, because he was appointed U.S. ambassador to Ghana, West Africa, and was in that high-level post in 1966 when founding father Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana coming to independence in 1957 under his leadership. 1966, he was overthrown. Franklin Williams disclaims any knowledge of CIA activity that contributed to Nkrumah's overthrow. Others beg to differ. But in any case, that illustrates another theme of this book that I think is relevant for the present moment. What I mean by that is that many have been struck with the speed and velocity with which many stalwart regulations have been tossed into the wastebasket by Mr. Trump, the tangerine tyrant.
That's right.
But I would argue that, for example, the executive order issued by President Johnson in 1965, which formed a foundation for affirmative action, that was the product of a particular historical moment. The historical moment being that the United States, during the Cold War, found it difficult to win hearts and minds in rapidly liberated in Africa and Caribbean that were rapidly being liberated, as long as people of color, particularly Black Americans, were treated so atrociously. So that creates a dynamic for the United States to try to improve its record. Of course, there are mass uprisings. Against that, you can see the mass uprising as being prefiguring November 5th, 2024. I'm thinking of the mass uprising in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, actually about the same time as Ghana's independence, because of opposition to desegregation of Central High School, something similar at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi at Oxford, 1962, deaths on that campus. It was not sectional because there was the revolt against busing for the purposes of school desegregation in Boston in the 1970s, a revolt against desegregating housing in Yonkers, just north of the Bronx in the 1980s, represented, by the way, in a movie you should be familiar with, Show Me a Hero, which is a dramatization of those particular events. So this is the tumult out of which emerges a weakened Communist Party, subjected to anti-communist trials, their leadership put on trial, both from the North and the South in the early 1950s. And then the emergence of the Black Panther Party circa 1966 under the leadership of Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. But alas, because of COINTELPRO and pre-existing tensions, they are racked with internecine discord, not only in terms of Eldridge Cleaver, who I've mentioned, coming into conflict with the leadership symbolized by Newton, but also the conflict in the Southland between the Panthers and the so-called cultural nationalists, symbolized by a man still in the land of the living, formerly known as Ron Karenga, now Malana Karenga, known to some, I'm sure, because of this popularizing of the year-end holiday Kwanzaa. You may recall that in January 1969 on the UCLA campus, there was a shootout that led to the deaths of two Panther leaders. Arguably, the Panther chapter in the Southland really never recovered from that bloody episode, but it's symbolic of what your question intimated. That is to say, those who one would have thought might have had something in common were at each other's throats. And that leads me to another point, which is that I'm not sure if the historians have done justice to some of these issues that I'm writing about. Not only done justice to the Panthers, I won't mention any names, but some of you are probably already familiar with some of the rather merciless attacks on the Black Panther Party.
Indeed.
But also in terms of the rubrics, because there's this rubric of Black power that puts under one umbrella people who oftentimes were at each other's throats. What helped to distinguish the Panthers was that not only did they see themselves as the descendants of Malcolm X, but they also saw themselves as being influenced by socialism. And they put their movement in the context of African liberation movements, which acted similarly. January marks the anniversary of the assassination of Amilcar Cabral, a West African leader who influenced many, including myself. This was the era of African liberation movements that had a socialist bent. Frelimo of Mozambique, MPLA of Angola, for example, the ANC, the African National Congress of South Africa, for example, in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, which is actually longer than the book on the table now, I reference the socialist orientation of one Nelson Mandela, including membership in the South African Communist Party. So These are some of the threads that are tied together in the text before us today.
There was recently a feature article in the English magazine, business magazine, The Economist. And it was exactly the kind of reporting that one rarely sees in the press of the United States of America, what we nowadays call the media. And basically it detailed the involvement of the Department of Defense in the television and film industry. In fact, The Economist reported on over 200 film and television programs just within the last 12 months that were produced with the Department of Defense. And it went on to speculate that in the future, as far as film and television production in the United States are concerned, that nothing really gets off the ground anymore without the assistance and approval of the Department of Defense and the State Department. The reason why I bring that up is to circle back to some of the points that you just made, and it concerns a very salient reality, which has to do with the popular culture in the United States, which has gone way out of its way to try to convince Black Americans that they have nothing in common with the liberation struggles that are taking place around the rest of the world, particularly in South America, Central America, Africa, and Asia. Why that becomes so important to the discussion tonight is returning to what you were just speaking of, which has to do with this principle, and that is the alignment of the Black liberation struggle inside of the United States only gaining the science of maintaining and gaining power through its alignment with the struggles that are taking place with Blacks throughout the rest of the world. And so when we look at the points that you just made in terms of bringing the case to the United Nations, bringing the case to the International Criminal Court, to the International Court of Justice, this is the pathway that was devised not just by the folks that you mentioned, but we also find in the latter part of the 1960s with Dr. King. This is precisely where he landed on April 4th, 1967, with the speech Beyond Vietnam. Malcolm X, again, with the last recorded speech that he offered on his recent return and his construction of the Organization of African Unity. Both of these men stressed the importance of finding this alignment with liberation struggles internationally, raising the question of what was happening in the interior of the US to the level of a human rights struggle that was taking place internationally. Gerald, is it too much to say that this particular thread has been lost? Because when I look around today inside the United States, very, very few people in what is left of the left seem to be able to countenance this struggle as being necessarily an international one against imperialism. Is that fair to say?
Oh, sure, of course it is. As a matter of fact, what it reminds me of, if I may, is a book I just published a few days ago entitled African Americans and a New History of the United States of America. It basically traces our story from the early 1500s, actually going before the early 1500s to the present. In some ways, it stretches back to the Crusades at the end of the 11th century to the present, because one of the points that I make in this text is that if you look at the system called settler colonialism, which is still operative, as reflected in the eloquent land acknowledgement at the top of our discussion, that it involved class collaboration between and amongst the European settlers. And you saw an example of class collaboration, that is to say, settler descendants uniting across class lines on November 5th, 2024. However, the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the enslaved Africans, by dint of the atrocities they were subjected to, were forced to become involved in class struggle, and were forced to become involved in internationalism, not only in the 20th century, which I've already made reference to, but acting in a similar fashion, trying to, just like the Haitian Revolution, which I wrote an entire book about. You saw the Toussaint. He's shifting alliances, allying perhaps with the British against the French, and then with the French against the Spanish, etc. And Black Americans were doing the same thing. For example, that internationalism has been a hallmark of our struggle, as your intelligent question suggested. But what happened with what I call the Compromise of 1954, that is to say, the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the United States Supreme Court, where Earl Warren, the former governor of California, then Chief Justice, roots in the Bay Area, by the way, wrote a majority opinion saying, oh, guess what, folks? Jim Crow is unconstitutional. Of course, this was because of international pressure already made reference to.
That's right.
One almost has to take that position because, as I say in the book, in the preceding decade as governor of California, Governor Warren was an enthusiastic advocate of internment of Japanese Americans. And so it's not as if he were a practiced civil libertarian. And so what happens is that as a result of that compromise, a high price was paid because our internationalists, like Paul Robeson in the first instance, were tossed overboard. And now the wolf was at the door because the objective conditions that led to the retreat of Jim Crow have retreated. And obviously the Tangerine Tyrant is well aware, which is why he's moved with such velocity and speed since January 20th, to try to erode many of the gains we thought were eternal. And here's another tip. He's also trying to overthrow birthright citizenship. That's this idea embedded in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution emerging after the U.S. Civil War that says that anyone born on the soil is a U.S. national. Birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment was an attempt to overturn the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which said that people of African ancestry cannot be citizens of the United States. I hope I'm not being alarmist to suggest that if you're overthrowing birthright citizenship, which was premised on overturning Dred Scott, then you might have the camel's nose in the tent. That is to say, Dred Scott making an ugly return. And given the fact, as I've written about at length, and will be writing about even more in books that come out next year, there has been a concerted effort over the years to get rid of the Negro population of the United States of America.
That's exactly right.
One interpretation of the movement of Marcus Garvey, who, as you know, Mr. Biden gave a pardon as he was going out of the door, was that he attracted so many adherents with regard to the Back to Africa slogan because people thought it would be better to jump instead of being pushed, for example. And so with the impending overthrow of birthright citizenship, which I think is a possibility, then that opens the door to a return of Dred Scott. And then we'll have to reconsider the Compromise of 1954 as well, which, as I said, in a sense was built on a foundation of sand, since it involved severe compromises such as the sidelining and marginalizing of people like Robeson. It reminds me of what historians of Central America have referenced when they talk about U.S. counterinsurgency. In Guatemala, for example, in the 1950s, they say it was an example of beans and rifles. That is to say, accept the beans or be subjected to the rifles. And so that was a choice of Black America: accept these anti-Jim Crow concessions or walk the plank like Paul Robeson and William Patterson, who, by the way, served a time in jail, and Robeson barely escaped sane. So this is what we're faced with today. And I remain optimistic, some might say naively so, that we can overcome, but I'm not necessarily going to argue strenuously with those who disagree with my analysis.
And for those in the listening audience who may not be familiar with the substance of the 14th Amendment, which Gerald Horne is making reference to, this is part of a group of amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which are often simply referred to as the Civil War amendments. And to be clear, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in recent decades, from the far right, from the Federalist Society, from the fascist authoritarian within the Republican Party, who has successfully taken over the United States government, it is specifically these three amendments which they have been sandbagging and attempting to make, in essence, unenforceable. It is certainly obvious that they would like to remove them. I don't know if that is possible. That's a whole nother program. But it is that entire raft of amendments and the laws attendant to them that have been sandbagged in recent decades, and the pushback against the enforcement has largely been successful in recent years. But I want to get into something which you and I spoke about off camera, and it gets right back into what we were just saying here. And it has to do with really what has been, for centuries, the Achilles heel of the United States of America. And that is the failure, the abject failure to accept Black leadership, right? Now, what I mean by that is we look over the history of the United States, we find many figures who, at one point or another within their public careers, exalted and were enthusiastic about the prospect of celebrating and bringing the United States to its ideals. I'm thinking of people, of course, like Frederick Douglass, like W.E.B. Du Bois, the aforementioned Robeson, and also certainly Dr. King. But in every single incident with each of these men that I mentioned and many others, the United States of America turned against them, applied techniques of degradation, humiliation to dispirit them, and destroy or assassinate them for their attempts to bring about the valiant leadership that was needed at the time to move the Republic not towards any abstract goal other than the very ideals which it alleged to be. So we're talking about, again, the failure to accept Black leadership. And I think that really penetrates right into the narrative of the book, Armed Struggle, because, as I mentioned, there was a point when Black Panther David Hilliard brought John Genet to the Bay Area for a conference with many, many, many different radical groups who were publishing their own newspapers at the time. And Genet said, look, if you don't stop putting political content in between stories about sex and rock music, then you've already failed. In fact, Genet went further to say, I believe that the so-called radical whites, if they fail to accept the leadership of the Black vanguard, will simply roll back and affiliate with the authority of the police. And I think it's fair to say that's exactly what happened. We were precipitate to a political revolution. But once again, the failure to accept Black leadership hobbled and crippled the United States from moving forward on these many issues. Gerald Horne, could you speak to that problem, both historically and in the context of your book?
Well, it illustrates one of the themes, because one does not have to be a close reader of this text to glean a thesis, which is that I'm critical of many of the organized forces on the left, including the Communist Party and the Black Panther Party, for not theorizing the concept of settler colonialism. In fact, settler colonialism is hardly part of the ordinary vocabulary of people on the left today. Although, as any school child can tell you, at a certain point, you had an invasion from across the Atlantic with the liquidation of many independent indigenous nations, and then dragging enslaved Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free. Mm. Now, because of the inability to theorize settler colonialism and this underpinning, which is class collaboration, that is to say, Europeans, settler descendants uniting across class lines as they did on November 5th, 2024, it leads to incorrect political estimates. For example, thinking that you can launch armed struggle and you can count on getting some support from settler descendants, for example. But obviously, that was not the case. I mean, I talk about the election totals that and the popularity of right-wing figures. California is now seen as the bluest of the blue states, but even those without as many gray hairs as mine, recall there was also the state of Ronald Wilson Reagan, Richard Milhous Nixon, and other figures to the right, the John Birch Society of Orange County, for example. Today's Prison Guards Union, which tries to ensure that prison beds are filled, oftentimes with Black youth from the Southland being bused up north. And so this has been a major problem, and I think it helps to account for some of our problems today. Certainly, it helps to account for some of the problems that the Panthers and the communists endured. And even today, people find it hard to believe the results of November 5th, 2024. 77 million people voting for the Tangerine Tyrant, knowing in advance what he planned to do, which he has just done on what people in Washington are calling Hell Week, beginning January 20th. Actually, it's more than a week now. It's maybe it'll be a hell 4 years. But, and of course, the latest scandal, it's on the front page of the New York Times website today, as we speak. The plane crash in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Apparently, the air traffic controller's booth was not staffed sufficiently because they have this mania for cutting the federal budget by any means necessary. And here's something to think about for both yourselves and our audience, because also in the New York Times today, there was this article about how certain Democratic governors are saying that they think that the way for this fever to break is for people to feel the pain voting for Trump. And then they'll realize the mistake they made. I'm not so sure.
I don't think.
I'm not so sure.
No.
It's just like Trump today. He blamed the crash on DEI. It reminds me, the Republicans, they have this trope now where they say, if I get on a plane and I see a Black pilot, I get nervous. I think he's a DEI hire.
Good Lord.
And the plane is going to go down.
Uh,
So, I mean, at least I'm laughing about this. I guess I have to laugh to keep from crying.
there
But
it is.
it's reflective. I think our friends on the left, including the Panthers and the communists, I think sometimes the rhetoric notwithstanding, they may have underestimated the toxicity of white supremacy, how deeply
Oh,
imbued
absolutely.
and embedded it was. And certainly, even those who would echo the analysis I just put forward for the Compromise of 1954, how it was driven by external events, global events, still there seems to be this naive belief
Oh,
that there was
absolutely.
a change of hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And then the electorate keeps slapping us upside the head and said, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Well, I mean, for listeners who may be in some doubt about Dr. Horne's assertion here, you can try this as an experiment because I believe that if you go out there and you ask the majority of so-called white people whether or not they are racists, they will tell you emphatically no. But if you ask that same majority what racism is, you'll get a lot of inchoate, nebulous, kind of out of focus, not exactly on target. So, on the one hand, absolutely convinced that they are not this thing. And on the other hand, not really quite sure what that thing may actually be, which leads us to this sort of an impasse where people often feign a shock or a lack of awareness about the extremity of the bureaucratic, social, economic violence that is perpetuated uh, for centuries in the so-called New World. But in a few moments, we're going to shift to questions, which we will be taking from the audience. But before we get into it, I want to focus on a particular sentence from the book, and hopefully you could expand upon this a bit, and then we can move over to the Q&A. This sentence appears on page 372, and I'll read the whole thing in part, but it's a section that we're going to focus on here. What was wrong in part was a tendency to fold Black Americans too easily into an overarching US identity, ignoring their understandable longing for Africa, which should be directed towards anti-imperialism. So the part of this sentence, Gerald Horne, that I'd like to ask you to expand a bit on is the tendency to fold Black Americans too easily into an overarching US identity. Because in point of fact, the many variations on opinion and conceptual understanding, vocabulary, sometimes rigorous, sometimes not, that exists within this expansive panorama of the Black population in the United States is extremely diverse. And very rarely, if ever, is that diversity represented. The caricature that is employed in the corporate sponsored politics, the popular culture, the so-called news media, all of them eager to portray a Black America in a monolithic state. And I think we saw this in evidence during the proliferation of book lists, which followed the many protests following the George Floyd murder, where the book lists were just stacked with the liberal progressive intelligentsia of the publishing industry in the Northeast. And we didn't hear from any or very few Black writers who might be considered divergent from what the same line that we might hear from the state-sponsored media, such as PBS or NPR, et cetera. Gerald, could you talk to us about this this tendency to fold Black Americans too easily into an overarching U.S. identity, and how that has really, in many ways, led to this crisis?
Well, if I may, I think part of it turns on my previously articulated dichotomy. That is to say, settler colonialism based upon class collaboration between and amongst the settlers and now their descendants, and versus the enslaved Africans, the unpaid sector of the working class, by dint of their oppression and persecution, being forced to engage in class struggle. And class struggle and class collaboration is an uneasy mix, to put it euphemistically. Particularly, as you may know, I've written a number of books dealing with the pre-1865 era, including perhaps my most controversial book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which I can guarantee you is not on Mr. Trump's must-read list, which suggests that the Republic, the slaveholders' Republic, came into being on July 4th, 1776, and of course, look ahead with apprehension to the chauvinism and celebrations of July 4th, 2026, that this revolt against British rule was not led accidentally by enslavers, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. It was an enslavers' revolt in light of the growth of abolitionism in the mother country, not to mention the fact that London was tiring of expending blood and treasure to fight Native Americans so that land speculators like George Washington could profit. In the book I have coming out in the fall, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, there's a long footnote that details all of George Washington's land holdings. It's no accident that you can draw a straight line from George Washington, real estate speculator, to Donald Trump, real estate speculator. So in any case, I think that many of our friends on the left, perhaps for noble and good-hearted reasons, in their eagerness to integrate us, to use that now ancient term, into U.S. society, they had to overlook quite a bit and make a number of assumptions. And they thought it's just like post-1865, with Black Americans adopting these names like Horne, for example. Or it was an attempt to assimilate, for example, and an attempt to integrate, assuming that despite your melanin content and your so-called woolly locks, that if you're monolingual in English like the majority, if you have a name like a majority, if you pray to the same God as the majority, then you can be accepted. And I would hope and imagine that those illusions have been shattered, and that we now need to begin thinking about alternatives. But excuse me if I'm not optimistic about our ability to do that.
Now, again, I'll mention very briefly before turning over to Shauna Sherman, who will very graciously read many of our audience's questions, that I will be back in 2 weeks on February 12th with Ronald B. Neal to discuss Beyond Death and Jail, Anti-Blackness, Black Masculinity, and the Demonic Imagination, right here with the African American Center of the San Francisco Public Library. That is in February on the 12th. And so with that said, Gerald, if you will avail yourself, I believe there may be some questions from our audience that they would like to address to you. Shauna Sherman.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, there are a few questions. The first one is, as internationalists, how should we view Russia, taking into account that Putin appears to have alliances with far-right leaders in Europe, and some feel Russia abandoned Assad and Syria at a critical time in history? So in 2025, how should internationalists view Russia?
Well, it's a complicated question. I put out a book of essays that I've written over the decades called I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. And one of the last essays in that book deals with the Russia question, deals with the contradiction of North Atlantic politics, which is that the largest country in Europe by population and territory and the most well endowed in terms of natural resources is Russia, with a contemporary population of 150 million versus Federal Republic of Germany about 82 or 83 million. And a contradiction of European politics is trying to circumvent that demographic reality. You see it 200 years ago with Napoleon's attempt to invade Russia, and of course that he doesn't succeed, to spoiler alert. And then it leads to the Crimea War of the 1850s, whereby Britain and France unite with the Ottoman Turks to attack Russia. They have a better go at it. But what's interesting about the Crimea War is that religion is still a salient factor, and these are all Christian countries, except for the Ottoman Turks, and yet Christian powers unite with the Ottoman Turks against their supposed Christian brethren. And then in 1904, London sponsors the Japanese attack on Russia, which leads to Theodore Roosevelt getting a Nobel Peace Prize. And this is another turnabout, because supposedly Russia is the racial brethren, and yet London is sponsoring this rising Asian power to attack Russia, which then, of course, has all of these unanticipated consequences, such as the Russian Revolution, leading directly to that. And then, of course, the capstone, which is Hitler's invasion, Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, which turns Europe upside down, leading, at least for a while, to socialist regimes and a good deal of Eastern Europe before the house comes tumbling down, 1989 to 1991, leading to the so-called unipolar moment. And there had been this thinking that Russia would be integrated into the North Atlantic camp, but then that would overturn the what you would call the logic or illogic of the past few centuries, because the whole plan was to ensure that the largest and most well-endowed country was not the dominant power. And then at the same time, the European powers had a beef with Russia because, as I'm going to say in this book that comes out next year, some of you who are wondering about how Ethiopia was able to defeat the Italian invasion of the 1890s is the Christian alliance between Christian Russia and Christian Ethiopia that leads Russia to supply the Ethiopians with dozens of machine guns, thousands of rifles, etc. This is now seen as this great Pan-African victory, but in a sense, it was a Christian victory or a Russian-Ethiopian victory. And that's not even to get into support for national liberation movements in Southern Africa, in particular, be it Angola, Mozambique, etc. But to move forward to the post-1991 moment, there was this difficulty in integration. There was this movement to expand NATO to the borders of Russia, which obviously has backfired spectacularly. Because, once again, the North Atlantic powers led by the United States, they cut this deal with China under Nixon a half century ago. And that's actually a major theme of the Panther book. this anti-Soviet alliance. And the payoff, of course, was massive foreign direct investment into China, which has now created this juggernaut. I'm surprised you could walk down the streets in San Francisco today without being hit by a master of the universe diving out of a skyscraper because of the trillion dollar loss on Monday as a result of China coming up with DeepSeek, this AI challenger to open AI, and all the money that Meta, Facebook, and Google and Microsoft have spent on AI. I say all this to say that one of the reasons why Russia has now been able to stand up to Ukraine, because Mr. Trump, we had thought, was going to try to cut a deal with Russia, but you never know with this guy. But he's been attacking Russia lately, attacking Putin lately. So I don't know where he is. Maybe he doesn't know where he is. But it's going to be difficult to flip Russia the way China was flipped, which does not augur well for the North Atlantic countries. So with regard to Ukraine, I'm not sure what the questioner has to say about that, but it's a very complicated story. But in any case, it's no accident that many of the global South nations are not going along with the sanctions. And of course, the German economy is sinking because it was heavily dependent upon cheap energy from Russia. Now that's cut off. Now they have to buy, coincidentally enough, now they have to buy more expensive energy from the United States of America.
That's right.
Coincidentally enough, what a surprise.
Right.
And with regard to Syria, I'm keeping a close eye on Syria. I don't necessarily disagree with the premise, but I have to see more evidence, quite frankly, as opposed to speculation. Because let's face it, the sanctions of the North Atlantic countries basically hollowed out the Syrian economy, made it difficult for the army to get paid. You could get paid more as a rebel by several orders of magnitude than being paid by the Assad army, for example. Now, there was a story just in the press today about how the Russian foreign minister is in Damascus talking with rebranded ISIS, Mr. Gilani, rebranded Al-Qaeda. And supposedly Mr. Gilani says, you got to turn over Assad. So we'll see what happens. I've been around long enough to know that today's Russia is not the old Soviet Union, but I've also studied the situation enough to know that there are fundamental contradictions in European politics that I've just articulated with regard to Russia being the most populous country, the most well-endowed country with the largest amount of territory, and yet this systematic attempt from making sure it does not exercise the sort of influence and power that those factors should allow it to do. And so Europe right now is trapped, just like Canada's trapped. Canada and Europe now have complicated relations with China, Russia, and the United States of America. They're going to have to make a compromise with one or the other. My guess is that they'll make a compromise with the United States of America and try to continue Cold War II with regard to China and Russia, but I don't see that working out very well. But, we'll see. I've been wrong before.
Thank you. The next question brings it back to your book. So one of the many themes that comes through in the book is the fact that a more revolutionary than thou is ultimately a self-injurious enterprise. Firstly, how so? And does this more radical than thou approach exist today? And if so, how does it manifest?
Oh, it definitely exists today. If you had the stomach, you should look at the criticisms of yours truly, who's excoriated for being a right-winger. I mean, if I'm a right-winger, but I think it's sort of that there's a lot of sectarianism in the United States of America. You could see it, to speak objectively, I would say once again that it's a kind of ideological underdevelopment. premised on, which is reflected in this idea of being unable to acknowledge settler colonialism, being unable to acknowledge class collaboration. And I think that that helps to feed a certain kind of right opportunism and a certain kind of left opportunism. Right opportunism in the sense of trying to make rationalization and excuses for the Trump base. And then left opportunism for finding a person like myself not sufficiently progressive, for example. But it all stems from a certain kind of ideological underdevelopment that we're going to have to overcome because, as you know, Madeleine Albright, the former Clinton Secretary of State, I think her last book was entitled Fascism, a Warning. And obviously she was no progressive, but she could read the tea leaves. And of course, during the fall campaign, there was a lot of talk about the rise of fascism in this country. The fact that the miscreants of January 6, 2021 were freed by Mr. Trump in one of his first actions opens the door for a private militia, as he said during the debate in the fall of 2020 with Mr. Biden. Proud Boys, stand by. So, oh my goodness. So, to paraphrase Jay-Z, we have many problems, but I don't think I'm one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, one more question. So many of our friends on the left today are very critical of Angela Davis. What is your reaction to this sentiment?
Well, I think a lot of people are mad with Angela because she walked. I mean, but she walked in part because she was part of the Communist Party, which then was able to organize an international movement by dint of there being communist parties worldwide, then putting pressure on the Nixon administration. Whereas, as I said about one of the Panther trials in Los Angeles, at a certain point, there was nobody in the courtroom because they had abjured, by that point, a lot of communist support because they had gone all in with regard to Maoism, for example, in terms of that internecine ideological struggle. So I'm not part of the anti-AYD coalition, for example. I respect her. I respect her work. I respect the fact that she has been able to survive. And I think that some of the criticisms, as I said, I think there's a lingering sort of anti-communism about it, even though she left the Communist Party decades ago. But still, it reminds me of the United States. There's still a grudge against the Haitian Revolution because they had the gumption over 200 years ago to overthrow slavery. And so the idea is they should be punished forevermore. And in my long peroration about Moscow, I should have mentioned the continuing anger at the Bolshevik Revolution, which then went on to support African liberation. It was a real wounding blow to imperialism. And so there is this idea that Russia needs to suffer forevermore. And those who may have been liberated because of the Haitian Revolution, such as Black Americans, such as Angela, or benefited from the Soviet Union, such as Angela, there are double reasons to hold a grudge against her. And of course, those grudges I do not share.
Thanks. One more question came in from Ryan. Fidel was critical of Trotskyites, claiming that they were unwittingly allies of imperialism. Is Fidel's position an overstatement?
Well, these are tough questions. I have to say, you know, I wrote an essay for The Nation, the New York-based weekly, on one of the most celebrated devotees of Trotskyism, speaking of C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian-born activist, writer, intellectual. And after studying James, and particularly an appreciation for his book, The Black Jacobins, which unlike, I'm afraid to say, many communists or even many liberals, was a deep appreciation of the Haitian Revolution. And of course, my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, is sort of an homage to the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James's book. So my own opinion is, it's like my opinion with regard to China. I'm being accused now of being in the tank for China, even though I spent a good deal of the 70s and 80s criticizing Maoism. But I'm always open to evaluation and reevaluation. And in writing this essay about James, I was struck by the fact that unlike the United States, France, where he did most of this research, has had a vibrant Trotskyist movement. Jean Mélenchon, who should have been French president, but actually might still wind up being French president, is a former Trotskyist. Lionel Jospin, a former contender in French politics, a former Trotskyist. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I'm not just a historian and an analysis. I'm a political person. And so since this is being taped, since I'm on the record, I'm going to perhaps reserve judgment if the questioner doesn't mind.
Well, I hope they don't. This is a much lighter question from and sorry if I mispronounce your name, Kandake. Favorite books you've read recently?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm reading this book on Opus Dei, which is this secret Catholic society. As the saying goes, history is not conspiracy, but there are conspiracies in history. And you may know that the conservative U.S. Supreme Court is dominated by Catholics. J.D. Vance just converted to Catholicism. Newt Gingrich converted to Catholicism. Opus Dei starts in fascist Spain, but has tentacles all over the world. It's quite something. So if you it just came out, so you ought to be able to find. I think the author's name, his first name is Gareth, Gareth. So that should be enough to find it. Then I'm reading this book right now. It's easier to recount the stuff that I'm reading right now. My Country, Africa, by André Blouin. She is a woman who was born in Central African Republic, raised in Brazzaville, today's Republic of the Congo, and in the DRC, right across the Congo River, a comrade of Patrice Lumumba. She's featured in Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which you should stream immediately, if not sooner. It's nominated for an Oscar. I hope it wins the Oscar. It really should. It's a marvelous documentary about the overthrow of Lumumba. She was also an advisor to Sekou Touré of Guinea-Conakry. So those are the two books I'm reading, two of the books that I'm reading right now, and they're occupying quite a bit of my mental space. So, and it's probably crowded out other books that I'm reading. For example, I'm reading this book by Winthrop Jordan, former professor at Berkeley. You might recall his book, White Over Black, which I wasn't that into. But this book is about this slave conspiracy in Mississippi. I'm doing a project on slavery in Mississippi, so I'm reading a lot of books about slavery in Mississippi. And so I reckon it's very well written, very well researched. He's joined the ancestors, as they say nowadays. But I'm glad he left behind this book. It's very interesting. I can't remember the title, but if you just put into a search engine, Winthrop Jordan, slave conspiracy in Mississippi, I think it's LSU Press, it should come up. It came out about 30 years ago, actually. And the Andre Bluen book, My Country Africa, is published by, I think it's Verso. It just came out, 2024. And the Opus Dei book just came out too.
Thank you. I mean, we're coming close to the end now, but we do have one more question. Dr. Horne, do you have any names of people or organizations for young organizers to look into in or around Miami, Florida?
Miami. Well, as the lawyers say, a quitclaim deed is when you convey a deed, and if you accept it, well, it may be valid, it may not be, but you're accepting. So let me quitclaim some names. And I hope I didn't cast aspersions beforehand. I know the African People's Socialist Party, they're based up north in Florida, in St. Petersburg, Tampa, but I assume they have branches in Miami. The traditional organizations, I'm sure, have resources and bases in Miami, such as the Communist Party, for example. I doubt if there are any Cuba Solidarity committees in Miami, because people, they don't play that. No. You know, if there were, they'd probably been bombed out of existence. And I kid you not. No. But who knows? Maybe things have changed.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Justin, do you have any final words before I close this out, or Dr. Horne?
No, I thank you, Shauna. I just want to very quickly thank our guest, Gerald Horne, and again mention the book is Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, Gerald Horne. And extend my thanks to the African American Center of the San Francisco Public Library, with whom I have been collaborating with these programs since 2004, so the last 21 years. And of course, also extend my thanks to the Before Columbus Foundation for their role in bringing this event to the African American Center. And of course, my thanks again to Gerald Horne. So Gerald, thank you for being so generous with your time today. And we'll look forward to developing more conversation in the future.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Horne, and thank you, Justin Demong, for this wonderful conversation. And please check out on.sfpl.org/more-than-a-month for any other Black History Month programs that we might be having here. There are a ton on the website. Thanks again. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.